So Belle Maniates was the daughter of a Greek immigrant who came to America as a child. He was a child during the Greek-Ottoman Wars with the Turks, and the island that he came from was sacked and virtually destroyed. And so the story is that her father was adopted by an American doctor who had been in Greece during the war and brought him back to America and educated him. There are some sources that suggest that her father's uncle or great uncle or possibly some other male relation, they're very foggy, may have been a very prominent Greek military leader and prime minister, actually. But that piece of the story is still a little bit fuzzy at this point in time. But he was somehow connected to a very illustrious family with political power in Greece. So he comes to America. He is educated as a physician, and he ends up marrying the daughter of an old New York family that had come to Michigan. And Belle was the fourth child born to them and the last. Her father died only a few months after she was born. So she was born in 1860 in Marshall, Michigan. And after her father died, her mother had, through her family, some state-level political connections. And so her mother starts to get some government work. So, for example, she is appointed with a job at the post office, which these are all appointed positions. That was a federal appointment, but if you knew somebody at the state, that often helped. So Belle is able to go to school. She goes through high school, and she will actually teach briefly, but then she herself gets into government work, which was a respectable place for a young woman to work by the time she is of age. So she spends several years in Detroit working in an office handling Civil War pensions for the federal government. And then in the mid-1890s, she gets work in Lansing. So she moves to Lansing, and she will work in both the Auditor and the Adjutant General's offices then in the Capitol building. And she will spend close to 25 years there. She will work into the early 1920s as a clerk and will actually rise up and will be, I believe, the senior female clerk in her office. Some of the offices were a bit gender segregated, so they would have women doing a certain type of clerking over here, and there would be sort of a senior female official overseeing them, and then they would be, in some cases, separate from the men. Didn't work that way in every department, but I believe it did in hers at that point in time. Belle always loved to write as a child. And actually, when she was a young girl, a teenager, she and a friend published this newspaper just for the fun of it. They wanted to do this. It's almost like, a scene out of Little Women where the Pickwick Club is producing their own paper. So she clearly always loved to write, and she had a good enough education that she felt she could pursue it. I suspect she was the kind of woman who was not content being still, because she managed both a full-time career as well as a second career as a writer. And we start to see short stories that she has written pop up in newspapers. Some of them will pop up in national magazines in the very early 20th century, so 1902, 1905, right in there. And she gets connected with basically what were called a syndicate. So newspapers would work with, or firms would work with authors, and they would publish their stories across the country. And you can see these. If you go back in old Lansing newspapers from this period, you can see where on one page out of 8, a couple days a week, there's the next chapter of an ongoing saga. What makes these complicated is understanding how the networks developed, but also understanding how the stories were changed, because sometimes you see the same story by Belle Maniates, but you see different bits clipped out. So they were definitely excerpted, and she probably didn't have full control over what was being published where. So Belle was able to eventually get contracts for novels, and she becomes known as a novelist. Her first novel, David Dunne, was published in the 1911, I believe it was, instantly becomes the most popular book at the Lansing Library because everybody is keen to read the book about the lady they know who lives down the street and works at the Capitol building. It's about a little boy who is orphaned. He is adopted and raised by neighbors, and ultimately he grows up to be this great advocate for the people. What I love about the book is it is very clearly set in our Capitol building, and there are scenes where they are going to the rotunda to see the old Civil War battle flags. There are scenes in the governor's office where he talks about, opening up a cabinet to pull out a glass, and I'm thinking, I know which cabinet that probably is. There are scenes in the House chamber where the girl who admires him is watching down from the balcony up above. If you know our building, you can imagine these things happening in that Capitol, in those very spaces that she knew. Now, sadly, from my perspective, she doesn't continue to write about politics in the Capitol. She will publish, depending on how you count them, either 7 or 8 novels. People debate whether Little Boy Bear is a novel or a novella because it's relatively small. This was very much a book for a child, and interestingly, it was actually dedicated to the son of the family that she lived with at one point, who did live in Lansing. It is, if we look here, dedicated to John Francis Brisbane, who I think was about 4 or 5 years old at the time. And Belle, like a lot of working women, did not keep her own home. She rented a room, or she lived in boarding houses, or even later on in life where she lives in a home that I believe she owns legally, she is living with other women. So she is not keeping a house because she is a professional woman, and she has not one but 2 careers. This woman works all day and comes home and writes all evening and probably most of her weekends, which means she just does not have the means does not have the time to fill that traditional domestic role. The book that she is best known for is Amarilly of Clothes-Line Alley. This was her bestseller. This was what her publishers wanted more of the rest of her career, and she pushed back. She's like, no, I want to write other things. I don't need to write more Amarilly. There are 2 Amarilly books. It's the only set in her collection. Amarilly of Clothes-Line Alley is about a young woman who lives in a poor family, is sort of adopted and educated by these wealthier women who see something in her and want to encourage this. And ultimately, she has to make a decision at the end. Is she going to marry, or is she going to use her education? And she decides not to marry, at least not in this book, although the sequel is called Amarilly in Love. So we will leave that to you to determine what you think happens. This became such a hit that it actually was turned into a Hollywood film. Now, this is back in the silent film era, and it was made into a Hollywood film starring Mary Pickford, who is considered to be the first sweetheart of the American silver screen. So this was as good as you could get in American pop culture at that time. And that's really what she became known for. There were a couple other books or stories that Dr. Oman believes may have been turned into silent films as well. There's a suggestion that one book may have been rewritten as a play at one point in time. But as far as I am aware, Dr. Oman has yet to actually turn those up and see if they still survive. But it is interesting to watch Amarilly of Clothes-Line Alley today, which does exist. It is out there in the public domain. And to think, as much as it does deviate from the book a bit, to think, this was written by a woman working in the Capitol building where I work every day.